السابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Today then, carrying on with the book of Hajj, explaining how to do the Hajj, we're going to be discussing the boundaries, because around Makkah there are certain geographical boundaries that if you want to do Hajj, you have to make sure you are in the state of Ihram before crossing into those boundaries. We're going to explain what these boundaries are, where they are, in this coming section now. So, Babul Mawaqit. المواقيت جمع ميقات وهو الحد المحدد للعبادة زمانيا أو مكانيا. So these boundaries, Islamically speaking, there are boundaries which are restricted by time, and there are boundaries that are physical in terms of locations. So in terms of the time restricted boundaries in Islam, certain acts of worship are restricted by certain time periods in Islam. One of the most obvious examples is the prayer. 5 prayers every day, but you can't just pray them whenever you want. There are certain time zones for each prayer. So the morning prayer has to be prayed before sunrise, has to be prayed when the second dawn appears up until sunrise. That is the restricted time period. The second prayer, Dhuhr, has to be prayed after the sun goes past the middle of the day. You cannot pray Dhuhr prior to the noon. Must be after the noon, after the middle of the day. Then Asr prayer can only be prayed when the shadow of an object outside is equal to its own length or more. When it goes beyond the size of its own length, then now you know Asr time has entered. And Maghrib, of course, is after sunset, and Isha is after the disappearance of the twilight, the redness that is left in the sky. The point being, those 5 prayers have fixed time periods during the day, restricted time zones within which you have to pray those prayers. So Islamically, there are boundaries in terms of time, the prayer being one example. Even the Hajj has time boundaries to it. The Hajj, you can't just go and do it any time of the year when you're free. Hajj is at a specific time of the year. The months of Hajj, they begin after which month finishes? Dhul Hijjah is the actual month of Hajj, but when do the overall months of Hajj begin? After Ramadan ends. When the Ramadan ends and Eid occurs, then after that the months of Hajj, they begin. So even Hajj has a time boundary associated to it. You cannot just go and do Hajj anytime. It must be within those specific time frames that the Hajj can be performed. So there are time boundaries for certain acts of worship in Islam. There are also physical boundaries for certain other acts of worship in Islam. And this is one of the examples. Because when you do Hajj, you have to be in a certain state, known as the state of Ihram. Islamically known as the state of Ihram. And that is when you make your intention to do the Hajj. And once you make that intention to do the Hajj, so you have now entered into the state of Ihram, it is now impermissible, not allowed, for you to do certain things that were permissible beforehand. So, for example, we're going to come to all of these impermissibilities. You're not allowed to cut your hair, for example, cut your nails, for example. You can't do that when you are in the state of Ihram. And to do Hajj, that is the state you have to assume. That state is only assumed once you arrive at the physical boundaries for Hajj. So you have Makkah, and then around Makkah in each direction, there are physical boundaries. Not physically in terms of actual posts, but they will be labeled as well now in those countries and areas. But there are physical boundaries around Makkah. When you're coming from whichever side of the world you're coming from, you go in your normal state as you are. But when you arrive at one of those boundaries, you must now assume the state of Ihram, which of course includes the wearing of the white garments that you see, and of course primarily the intention of doing your Hajj now, and therefore it becomes impermissible for you to do certain things like cutting your hair, covering your head for the men, intercourse. Various matters now become impermissible when you enter the state of Ihram. And that state of Ihram is entered upon at the latest when you arrive at one of those boundaries. You're not allowed to go through all the way to Makkah and then decide, okay, let me go into the state of Ihram now to do Hajj. You must go into that state at the boundary at the latest. That's why when people go from here to do Hajj and they go on the plane typically lands in the city of Jeddah, which happens to be inside of the, or at least you cross over the boundary entering into the airport of Jeddah from the UK. So the people who go from the UK, they can't just go up to the airport of Jeddah, get out at the airport and go into the state of Ihram. They need to do it before that arrival into Jeddah by 10, 20 minutes, whatever it is, from the direction of the UK. And that's why you see people on the plane, maybe they are going and preparing themselves and wearing the white garments and entering into that intention of Ihram so that they can perform the Hajj. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. Where are those physical boundaries? Where are they from each direction? If you're coming from the northern side, from Syria, Iraq, Jordan, from that area, where is your boundary located? If you're coming from Africa, where is your boundary? You're coming from Europe, where is your boundary? From Australia, where is your boundary? Where are these physical boundaries around Makkah? That is what we will be talking about and discussing in this particular chapter, inshallah. Briefly, just as a summary, before we go into the details, as a summary of what they are, then they are named as 5 boundaries. There are 5 named boundaries around Makkah. One of them is known as Dhul Hulayfa. One of them is known as Dhul Hulayfa. And that is the boundary for the people of Medina. Those people who are coming from the direction of Medina towards Makkah, then they have a boundary which is just on the outskirts of Medina, known as Dhul Hulayfa. Then there is another one known as Al-Jourfah. Al-Jourfah. And that is the boundary for the people coming from Egypt and Morocco and Palestine and that kind of area, northwestern kind of area. Those coming from that direction have a boundary known as Al-Jourfah. We're going to go into a bit more detail with all of these later, but as a summary to know what the 5 are. Another one is known as Yalamlam. Yalamlam. And that is the boundary for the people coming from the southern areas of Yemen. Those coming from that southern side, Yalamlam. Another one, Qarnul Manazil, for the people of Najd. Najd is another area from the mostly southern side. Najd, those coming from that side, from the eastern side, southern side, then they have Najd. Or they have Qarnul Manazil. They have the name Qarnul Manazil for that boundary. And then there is Dhatu Irq, and that is for the people of Iraq. Coming from the direction of Iraq, from that area, they would cross the boundary known as Dhatu Irq. وهذا يوم كان الناس يأتون على الرواحل أما الآن فالناس يأتون على الطرق المعبدة فكل من مر بطريقه بميقات من هذه المواقيت فإنه يحرم سواء كان ميقاته الأصلي أو ميقات غيره كما يأتي هذا. So regardless of whether you actually live in that direction, you are going to assume the state of ihram from whichever boundary you happen to be crossing. So even if you're not from the people of Egypt, but you happen to be in Egypt, and then you're going to go to Saudi to do Umrah or Hajj, then you would assume your ihram from the boundary you come across there. If you're in Iraq, you happen to be there, then you're going to go and do Umrah or Hajj, you would assume your ihram from the boundary you come across from that direction then. So you assume your ihram from whichever side, whichever boundary you happen to come across from where you are. So we're going to go into more detail about these boundaries one by one as we go along this section. First hadith that we have here then, عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقت لأهل المدينة ذا الحليفة ولأهل الشام الجحفة ولأهل النجد قرن المنازل ولأهل اليمن يلملم هن لهن ولمن أتى عليهن من غيرهن ممن أراد الحج والعمرة ومن كان دون ذلك فمن حيث أنشأه حتى أهل مكة من مكة متفق عليه. Ibn Abbas mentions here that the Prophet ﷺ designated for the people of Medina the boundary known as Dhul Hulayfa, and for the people of Sham, Palestine, Jordan, those areas, the boundary known as Al-Jourfah, and the people of Najd, the boundary known as Qarnul Manazil, and the people of Yemen, the boundary known as Yalamlam. They are for them and for whoever comes that way, even if they are not from the people of that area. Whoever comes from that direction wanting to do Hajj or Umrah, then they are the boundaries that they must assume their ihram from. But what about if you happen to be living, your home is somewhere within the boundary zone? What if you live somewhere that is within the boundary zone? Then the hadith says, وَمَنْ كَانَ دُونَ ذَلِكَ فَمِنْ حَيْثُ أَنْشَأَ. If you live within the boundary zone, then you assume your state of ihram from there, from your home, from where you are, and you proceed. But you don't need to then go back out to where the boundary is to then come back in. Where you are, from there you proceed onwards then, even if you happen to be living right in Makkah, then you assume your ihram from your home in Makkah and proceed. So this hadith is the evidence that those boundaries exist. Because remember, everything we say about religion, about Islam, it must be based upon authentic evidence that can be proven. Hadith and narrations going back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here we have one which is in the book of Al-Bukhari and the book of Muslim, two of the famous books of hadith. And so this is a narration where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam highlighted and designated those boundaries for the people coming in to do Hajj and Umrah. This also is to make it easy for everyone. If there was only one outer boundary, then it would cause difficulty for people having to go different directions and come through one particular road or route. But now the boundaries are in a type of circular fashion around Makkah, then whichever direction you're coming from, there is a boundary that you can pass through, and it doesn't necessitate you have to pass directly through it. But if you are level to where that boundary is, you could be miles down, but you know at this stage the boundary comes up, then you go through that area with your ihram assumed. This is also a proof of the prophethood. How is it a proof of the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? At the time when the Prophet designated these boundaries, the boundary of the people of Medina, no problem. Medina was full of Muslims. But all these other areas, talking about Africa and Iraq and Jordan and all these other areas, were they areas known for Muslims, and were they lands that were lands of Islam? Not necessarily at all. So why did the Messenger appoint and designate boundaries up there where there were no Muslims and there weren't Muslim countries over there? It is a sign from the signs of the prophethood that it was known that Islam would spread and the boundaries would be needed in those areas also. So this is a sign from the signs of the prophethood that he allocated and designated boundaries on the other sides as well, even though in those days there wouldn't have been hardly anyone coming from those other directions. So these are the boundaries. The boundary of the people of Medina is Dhul Hulayfa. Dhul Hulayfa, and this is from the word Halfa. And Halfa is the name of a particular type of tree. So that area was known for these particular types of trees. Where the boundary was allocated, this is the designated boundary. It was an area known for those particular types of trees. So that area was then known as Dhul Hulayfa, the area possessing and having those particular types of trees in it. So that was the area, and it is in a type of valley. That area is in a type of valley, Wadi al-Aqiq, which is to the south of Medina, next to Mount Ayr. And there is a mosque there now known as Masjid Shajara at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. ويبعد عن المدينة مقدار فرسخ فقط يعني 3 أميال عن المدينة. And so that boundary, it is on the outskirts of Medina, to the southern side of Medina, just 3 miles outside of Medina. Just 3 miles outside of Medina. When you go there now, there's a big mosque there, showering facilities there, everything. You can prepare yourself, get ready. You can wear your white garments, assume your ihram, and then proceed from there. وهو أبعد المواقيت عن مكة. So if this is Makkah and there are all these boundaries, 5 of them around it, the furthest one away from Makkah is the boundary of Medina, Dhul Hulayfa. The other 4 are closer in. It's not a perfect circle. The boundary of Medina is further out. The other 4 are actually closer in. It's not like a perfect circle around Makkah. So the boundary of the people of Medina is the furthest one away, and that is the one which is known as Dhul Hulayfa. These days the Shaykh says people call it Abar Ali, the wells of Ali. They attribute some wells that were made there to Ali, but in reality it's actually known as Dhul Hulayfa. The second one then, which is the boundary for the people coming from the west, from Morocco and Egypt and those areas to the west compared to where Makkah is, and even some of the Arab countries further up from the North African area, Palestine, Lebanon, maybe those areas. From those areas, those people coming from that side, then they have a boundary. ولأهل المغرب وأهل الشام وأهل مصر وغيرهم من الذين يأتون عن طريق الساحل قاصدين مكة حدد لهم صلى الله عليه وسلم الجحفة. So they have a boundary known as Al-Jourfah. Al-Jourfah was the name of a village that used to be in existence outside of Makkah. From that direction coming into Makkah, as you approached Makkah, not too far away from Makkah, there was a village by the name of Juhfa, and that's why that boundary was known as the boundary of Al-Jourfah. And there are other famous places around that area these days, a place by the name of Rabigh. You hear that? It is near there. And they give reasons as to why that area was known as Al-Jourfah, that it was overcome by flood water, etc., and it was destroyed, and that is from the meanings of the word Al-Jourfah. But they are just explanations of why it was termed that name there. But that is for the people coming from that direction, Al-Jourfah. For the people of Yemen, they come through Yalamlam. And that is the name of a particular place en route between Yemen and Mecca, a place known as Yalamlam. They say that it was the name of an actual geographical location known as Yalamlam, an area known as Yalamlam. Others, they say it was actually a mountain that was known as Mount Yalamlam. And these days also it is known as As-Sa'diyah. These are just names for that particular boundary coming from the direction of Yemen. And for the people of Najd, they have their boundary known as قرن المنازل وهو الوادي المستطيل الذي يأتي من الطائف ويمر بالسيل الكبير. So that is the valley which, an extended and long valley which comes from the area of Ta'if, another city, and passes through As-Sayl al-Kabir. So that is the boundary which is considered for the people of Najd, Qarnul Manazil. And again the Shaykh gives some details as to why the title is as it is and distinguishes it from some other affairs. But the point there is Qarnul Manazil for the area of Najd. So then it says Hunna lahunna. So those boundaries are for those people from those directions. Those people living in those directions, that's their boundaries. وَلِمَنْ أَتَى عَلَيْهِنَّ مِنْ غَيْرِهِنَّ. And also for anybody who's not from actually that direction, they don't live in that area, they don't live in those countries, but they happen to be passing through that area, then they also utilize the same boundary in assuming their ihram. And also, what if you have a person from Egypt, and so his boundary would be the boundary known as Al-Jourfah. But what if an Egyptian happened to be in Medina and he wants to go and do Hajj? Does he need to go back up there and come through his allocated boundary, or can he go through the boundary of the people of Medina now? Of course, go through the boundary of the people of Medina. The point is, you must be in the state of ihram before going through the boundary. That is the allocated boundary for each area, but if you happen to be in a different area, you just go through the boundary that you're at and you assume your ihram from that area. نعم. So هن لهن ولمن أتى عليهن لمن أتى عليهن من غير أهلهن ممن أراد الحج أو العمرة. The narration says you cannot pass through those boundaries if you intend to do Hajj and Umrah. You cannot pass through those boundaries unless you assume the state of Ihram. What if you want to go to Mecca, but you're not actually going for the sake of Umrah or Hajj? You need to go there to do some business, you need to go there to visit a relative. You're not going there to do Hajj or Umrah. Then do you still have to assume the state of Ihram? We're going to talk about what the state of Ihram is later in more detail, but basically, when you go into the state of Ihram, you're not allowed to cut your nails or cut your hair or have intercourse. Various things you're not allowed to do now when you assume the state of Ihram. So do you have to assume that state as a Muslim when going in through the boundaries if you're not intending to actually do Hajj or Umrah? No. No. That is the majority of the scholars. The correct opinion is that you don't have to be upon the state of Ihram. But there are some scholars who say no one should enter Makkah unless they assume the state of Ihram and do the Umrah. They say, what do you mean? You're going to go to Makkah and not even do Umrah? They say nobody should go into Umrah from outsiders. If you live there, that's different. You live in that area, you've gone somewhere, you come back, okay. But if you're a foreigner, you're from the UK, you're from this country, that country, even in Saudi Arabia, you're from some other areas, a foreigner to Makkah, you go to Makkah, you're not going to do Umrah. Some of the scholars say if you're a foreigner to Makkah, then you go into the state of Ihram and do your Umrah with whatever other business you have there. There are opinions like that. Some scholars say you cannot pass through the boundary unless you assume the state of Ihram. But the majority of them have mentioned it is only connected to the intention of wanting to do the worship of Hajj or Umrah. And if you're not doing that worship, you have some other business to take care of, then it is not a condition that you have to go into that state of Ihram. Then the final point that was mentioned was, what if you live somewhere, your home, your residence, where you live is somewhere within the zone, within the boundaries. فَمَنْ كَانَ دُونَ ذَلِكَ مَنْ كَانَ مَنْزِلُهُ دون هذه المواقيت مما يلي مكة فإنه يحرم من منزله. In that case then, if you live within the boundary zone, then you simply assume your state of ihram from your home and just proceed on to Makkah. You could be 10 miles outside of Makkah. You assume your ihram there and just proceed into Makkah. If you're living within the zone, then you simply assume your ihram from where you are and proceed on into Makkah and into Al-Masjid Al-Haram and to perform your rites of Umrah or Hajj. So that means if you're living within the boundary zone and you want to do the worship of Hajj and Umrah, it is not required of you to go out back to the nearest boundary to then assume your ihram and to then come back in again. That is not required of you. If you live within the zone, you simply make your ihram from where you are and proceed. That's getting complicated. We'll come to those one at a time. So for now, the basic ruling of whether you live outside or you live inside. Those kinds of issues now, what if you're on business and you went there so you never had an intention? That really is basically the issue of a foreigner going in without the intention of Hajj and Umrah, But then once he's inside the zone, he changes his mind and decides, actually, let me do it. So now what's the ruling? Does he assume it from there, or does he have to go out? But we'll come to that shortly afterwards. Let's finish the section here first. So then it mentions here, the people living inside of the zone, would make their ihram from within that zone, from wherever they live, and then proceed onwards. وكذلك كل من كان دون المواقيت مما يلي مكة من البلاد فمواقيتهم بلادهم يحرمون منها فمثلا أهل بدر يحرمون من بدر ولا يلزمهم الذهاب للحليفة. An example he gives is Badr, where the battle of Badr occurred. If people lived in Badr, then technically the closest boundary to them would be back at Medina. It would be back at Medina. But do they then have to go backwards to Medina to assume the ihram and come back? Then as we've said, no. They do not need to do that. They can simply do it from where they are and proceed onwards. أما العمرة فإنه إذا نوى من كان في مكة سواء كان من أهلها أو من غير أهلها فهذا لا بد له أن يخرج للحل فيحرم من الحل خارج الأميال إما من الجعرانة أو من التنعيم أو من عرفات أو من الحديبية. المهم أنه يخرج عن حدود الحرم ويحرم بالعمرة ولا يحرم بالعمرة من مكة. The Shaykh says, as for Umrah, for Hajj, that's everything we've been talking about. As for Umrah, if you live within the zone, for Umrah, the Shaykh says you should go out to the nearest boundary, even if it be something like Tan'im, Masjid Aisha as they say. You should go out to some level of the boundary and then assume your ihram and come in from there. If it is Umrah, Hajj, it is assumed from where you are. وهذا مذهب جمهور أهل العلم, and this is the position of the majority of the scholars. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لما أرادت عائشة العمرة, when Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wanted to do Umrah, she was told to go to Tan'im, what's known as Masjid Aisha now, close by, just outside of Makkah there. So at least from there, the Shaykh says that you would have to assume your ihram from. But as for Hajj, then from wherever you are, you assume it from there and you continue. What is the reason for that? Why is it that for Hajj, you can just assume your ihram from wherever you are within the zone and continue? You could be in Makkah, a resident of Makkah, assume it from your home and just walk up to the masjid and start your Hajj. But Umrah, you got to go out to the nearest boundary, or at least Masjid Aisha, Tan'im. Why the difference? Maybe they say because when you cross the boundary and come into the zone, the boundary zone now, it means that in your action of doing this worship, it involved being within that zone and also outside of the zone. You were originally outside of the zone and then you came into the zone. When you do Hajj, if you're a resident of Makkah, so you're inside of the boundary zone, and you make your intention, you assume ihram. During Hajj, what happens? You go outside into places like Arafah, Muzdalifah, outside of that haram area. So it's like you are still combining between being outside and inside. Whereas Umrah, you do all of it in the masjid. You don't go anywhere else, just in the mosque. There's no combination of being outside and inside. So maybe that's the reason why you have to have an outside and then an inside to combine between both of those. So what's the conclusion we can make here? The benefits taken from this section. Firstly, that there are designated boundaries outside of Makkah, 5 designated boundaries where the people cannot cross over if they want to do Hajj and Umrah unless they assume the state of Ihram. And if you do cross over that area without having assumed the state of ihram, then there are penalties. Islamically, you have to pay a certain penalty. And we'll explain later what those penalties are. If you go through the ihram without having assumed you go through the boundaries without having assumed your ihram, basically you have to slaughter something, give a sacrifice, but we'll get to those details later. Secondly, أن من أتى على هذه المواقيت وهو يريد الحج والعمرة وهو ليس من أهلها يجب عليه الإحرام منها. That those boundaries, even though names were given and areas were mentioned of where they are applicable to, if you are coming from a different place, even though you're from a different place, but you're coming from a different area, then you would pass through whatever boundary you are at. It is not a necessity to go back. And also, somebody who enters into that zone but not for the purpose of Hajj and Umrah, it does not necessitate they need to assume and enter into the state of Ihram. And also, if a person lives within that zone, then you simply make your Ihram from wherever you are and assume your intention from there and go and do your Hajj. But if it's for Umrah, then go out and then re-enter. And sixthly, the people of Makkah, which is similar to this, the people of Makkah, then they do not need to go out. They do not need to go out to perform their intention for the Hajj, but for Umrah, then they go out and return to perform that intention and assume that ihram. Similar to what was mentioned, what if somebody is a resident of Makkah, but he's not from there? Somebody moved there. You now moved there. You got a job there, you're living there, you've got your residency there, you live in Makkah. But you're not actually from the people of Makkah. Maybe 10 years from, you might leave again, 15 years time. So what ruling do you take? Do you take the ruling of a foreigner, that you go out and come in through the miqat, through the boundary, or are you considered from a resident within the zone now? Considered within the zone. You are living there. You're not just passing through or traveling through business, but you're living there. Somebody living there now, even if you're not from the people there. You're an outsider, but you settled there now, then you are considered from the people also, and you would therefore do your Umrah, your Hajj from where you are, but your Umrah still from the outside. The next narration here carries on with the same point, which is عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقت لأهل العراق ذات عرق. For the people of Iraq, coming from that area, they have ذات عرق. And that is another name of a place. ذات عرق اسم موضع على طريق القادمين من العراق إلى مكة شمال السيل الكبير ومحاذاة من جهة الشمال. So that is another area known as ذات عرق, where the people of Iraq coming from that area would pass through to get to Makkah. So that is where they would perform their intention or assume their ihram when coming in to do their Hajj or their Umrah. And in Muslim it mentions from the hadith of Jabir إلا أن راويه شك في رفعه, and in Al-Bukhari أن عمر هو الذي وقت ذات عرق. So there is some doubt here as to whether it was the Prophet ﷺ who mentioned ذات عرق, or whether that was from Umar ibn al-Khattab mentioning ذات عرق. إلا أن مؤخرا عمر وحدد وهيأ للإحرام لأن أهل البوادي التي حوله يشق عليهم الذهاب إلى السيل الكبير. So these days that area has been designated. It is something clear and the boundary is there, and that is where the people they assume their ihram from. فهيئ لهم الإحرام من نفس المكان الذي حدد بذات عرق. So the same place where ذات عرق was highlighted, that is where they perform their Umrah or their intention for Umrah from. Their Ihram is assumed from there. But like we said, there seems to be a difference regarding who appointed Dhatu Irq. The other four we mentioned, no doubt. But Dhatu Irq, from the area of Iraq, that boundary, is that something the Messenger mentioned himself, or is that something one of his students, one of the companions mentioned? اختلف في الذي حدده ففي رواية أبي داود والنسائي أن الذي حدده هو النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، وكذلك عند مسلم رواية جابر إلا أنه شك في رفعه إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. وفي صحيح البخاري أن الذي حدد ذلك هو عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه لما اشتكى إليه أهل العراق وقالوا إن ميقات أهل نجد جور عن طريقنا، يعني شاق علينا أن نعرج إليه، فحدد لهم رضي الله عنه ذات عرق لأنه هو الذي يقع في طريقهم. So it is mentioned that Umar ibn al-Khattab may have been the one who highlighted that boundary because the people of Iraq were complaining that the other boundary is too far from where they are, so that area was also designated for them to make their ihram from as they enter. But there is no issue in that. There's no issue in that. لا منافات بين كون عمر هو الذي حدده أو الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم، لأن الذي حدده في الأصل هو الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم، ولم يعلم عمر رضي الله عنه بتحديد الرسول، فاجتهد فوافق اجتهاده تحديد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So even if Umar ibn al-Khattab was the one who mentioned that, they say originally the messenger had appointed that boundary. The way that the boundaries were appointed, that was where the boundary is. So that is actually from the messenger, that side of it. But it was just mentioned by Umar ibn al-Khattab from his ijtihad afterwards, which therefore was in line with what the messenger had mentioned about the boundaries from that area. And the final narration there, وعند أحمد وأبي داود والترمذي عن ابن عباس أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقت لأهل المشرق العقيق. That for the people coming from the east, al-aqiq was mentioned, and that is the same as dhatu irq. Al-aqiq is the same as dhatu irq. If somebody was to say now the people of Jeddah, where do they do their ihram from? نقول أهل جدة يحرمون من جدة لأنها تحاذي يلملم وتحاذي الجحفة فهم يحرمون من بلدهم. So the people of Jeddah, they can do it from Jeddah, because when you look at the way that the boundaries are, the boundaries either side of them are in line with where they are. So it is on the line of the boundary where they are, so they can do their ihram from there and proceed onwards. وكذلك الذين يأتون من السودان ومن أفريقيا هؤلاء يحاذون المواقيت إن جاءوا من طريق البحر من الجنوب فإنهم يحرمون من محاذاة سعدية. So the people who come on boats, for example, they cross over from Africa towards Saudi Arabia, then again they would simply make the ihram coming in because they would be in line to where those boundaries are. They would be parallel or in line within the zone of how those boundaries are working. And he mentions at the end, people who come into the airport of Jeddah, then they should make their, assume their ihram from whenever their plane passes over whichever boundary they are coming from the direction of. Whichever boundary they are coming from the direction of, if their plane passes over it and comes into Jeddah, they should make their ihram from the boundary even if they're in the air yet, as is the case for the UK. The UK, prior to getting into Jeddah, you cross over one of the mawaqit, so that is where your ihram is assumed from. So here then, that is the 5 mawaqit, the 5 boundaries. So whenever somebody wants to do Hajj or Umrah, that's one of the first things to remember. You must assume that state of worship, of ihram, wear the white garments as you've seen, and have the intention that you are now in the state of ihram. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss next time. What is exactly the state of ihram? What can you do, what can you not do when you are assumed into the state of ihram? What's allowed, what's not allowed. So now imagine you're going to Hajj and Umrah and you've come to the boundary. You're at the zone. You now need to go into the state of Ihram because you know you can't go past the boundary without assuming that state. So that's exactly the next section we'll discuss next week. How do you assume the state of Ihram and what does it mean? It's not just the white garments that you see on TV when they're doing Hajj. Those white garments aren't just the Ihram. There's a lot more to it. So we'll discuss that next time, insha'Allah ta'ala. We'll conclude upon that for today. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions on that?